Hi there, my name is Rachel Kendall and I'm based at Durham University in the UK, and I'm currently president of the Cultural Evolution Society. And I'm here today to give you a lecture on social learning strategies. But first, I just want to explain a little bit about me. So I'm an interdisciplinary researcher with overlapping interests in cultural evolution, evolutionary anthropology, comparative and developmental psychology, primatology, and animal behavior. My focus is on cultural transmission, specifically social learning and behavioral innovation in a range of species, from fish to monkeys to humans, with a view to understanding the evolution of human culture and how we can usefully apply understanding of cultural evolution to issues such as animal conservation, human education, and public health. So this is the third lecture in the series on animal culture, core discoveries and new horizons. And we're going to be looking at social learning strategies. So following on from the earlier lecture you had from Alex Thornton on social learning processes, in this lecture, I'll be telling you about these adaptive biases in cultural transmission that influence whether or not individuals learn from others, and if they do learn from others, what they learn and from whom they acquire information. So this lecture will be split into sections. In this first section, we'll cover context-dependent state-based biases. In part B, we'll cover context-dependent model-based biases and frequency-dependent biases. And in part C, we'll look at content-dependent social learning strategies and conclusions and summary. So what are social learning strategies? Well, indiscriminate use of information is not beneficial. So individuals have to make selective use of asocial or personal information and social information, using strategies that influence when to use social information and from whom to acquire it. And this is because the different sources of information have different benefits and costs. So personal or asocial information is trustworthy because you've collected it for yourself, whereas observing others has the benefit of enabling rapid and efficient acquisition of information. Now, such heuristics or rules of thumb avoid two costs. The first cost is that associated with asocial learning, such as the time involved in learning for yourself, exposing yourself to predators or potentially to toxins. And the second cost is that associated with vetting every single cultural variant as displayed by individuals around you for its potential contribution to your fitness. So these heuristics or social learning strategies represent a trade-off between acquisition of accurate information on one hand and economical behavior on the other. So in other words, these heuristics allow for acquisition of pretty good information right now, as opposed to waiting for the evolution of perfect, whether it's unlearned or cultural adaptation to an environment which may well have changed by then. And when these psychological learning biases operate in populations over generations, they can actually generate cultural adaptations and influence the evolution of culture. So it's really important to understand social learning strategies when we're thinking about animal, including human culture. Here you can see a diagram which represents how we classify various social learning strategies into different categories. For example, those that are context dependent, which you can see here. So influenced by the state of the learner, state-based biases, the frequency of the to be copied trait, so frequency dependent biases, or the identity of the model, so model-based biases. In contrast, we have social learning strategies that are content dependent. So the learner is influenced by the trait itself, such as its payoff or its benefit, or its involvement of emotional reactions or social information such as gossip. And in this lecture, I will explain each category of social learning strategies and run through a few examples to give you an idea, but it certainly won't be exhaustive because there's really quite a lot of literature about social learning strategies now. But before we embark on this tour of social learning strategies in the animal kingdom, I should first clarify a few common erroneous assumptions people have about social learning strategies. So first, I want to emphasize to you that social learning strategies may be products of evolution or of learning within the lifetime, or both. Secondly, although we use the term strategy, this doesn't mean at all that social learning strategies or transmission biases are thought to be conscious. They may be consciously applied by individuals, probably most notably in humans, but the theory does not require them to be consciously applied at all. Thirdly, social learning strategies are best regarded as biases that shape behavior and not as hard and fast or strict rules that are blindly applied across all individuals or contexts. And also their use may change throughout development. Likewise, just as with social learning processes that you heard about in the previous lecture, several transmission biases or social learning strategies may be in operation simultaneously in any one cultural transmission event. For example, an individual may copy another rather than learn for themselves because they are very young, so a state-based bias, and they may be biased also to learn from individuals that are older than them or maybe of the same sex as them. That's a model-based bias. Finally, I should just point out that these social learning strategies may be particularly important in understanding why we see cumulative culture, that is the increasing complexity or efficiency of traits, such as technology over generations, in humans, but very little evidence of it in non-humans. And you'll hear much more about cumulative culture in a later lecture, number 9 by Nico Cladieri. But for now, I should just point out a few examples. So a social learning strategy that influences children to copy adults faithfully, for example, would allow for accurate transmission of a trait from generation to generation so that no beneficial aspects are lost. While a social learning strategy that influenced individuals to copy others if the payoff of the behavior they displayed was higher than their own, this would enable the incorporation of beneficial modifications to the trait and enable this cumulative evolution of ever more complex technology, for example, which we don't seem to see in the tool use of chimpanzees. Okay, so we're going to move on to considering context-dependent social learning strategies in more detail now. And in this lecture section, we'll focus in on state-based biases. So these are biases that individuals may have regarding whether to socially learn or to learn for themselves based on their own state, for example, their age, whether they're hungry, whether they are naive or ignorant. So this first example is a revisitation of the example from an earlier lecture you saw regarding social learning of cream stealing from milk bottles by great tits and blue tits. And you'll hear more from the author of this study, Lucy Aplin, in the lecture on culture in birds. So in an initial study, blue tits were captured from the wild and kept for just a very short time in the laboratory. And as seen in this photo here, these blue tits were able to observe others who were either piercing the lids over these little food wells or flipping the lids open to obtain food underneath. And it was found that in female juveniles, the dark grey bars on this figure here, were more likely to copy than adults. This copy when young social learning strategy is thought to be because females of dispersal age should be attuned to social information as it will help them cope with the challenges posed by novel physical and social environments into which they migrate. However, in males, a different pattern was seen. So the authors showed that the males had a greater reliance on social information when they were subordinate, represented on this figure by having a low David score, so these individuals here. And this is consistent with a copy of dissatisfied type strategy. So if your state or current status is suboptimal, you may prioritize acquiring social information. Now, we also see examples of the reproductive state of individuals influencing their propensity to use social information or whether to acquire personal information for themselves. So in this diagram here, you can see how this was investigated in stickleback fish. So the observer here is placed in a tank, and these are transparent partitions through which they can see two different populations of other sticklebacks who get to feed at these feeders here. And one of these feeders provides a lot of food, so it's the rich patch, and one provides very little food, so it's seen to be the poor patch by the observer. And these, once these fish have fed, the model fish are removed, and the observer is released by removing these transparent partitions, and it's recorded how long this observer fish spends in each foraging patch, so in each goal zone on the diagram. So in this figure here, you can see that increasingly positive numbers on the y-axis indicate more time spent at the rich patch than the poor patch by the observer fish. And as you can see, the foraging behavior of gravid or pregnant nine-spine sticklebacks, represented as GF here, was more heavily influenced by the social information as they spent more time at the rich patch than was the foraging behavior of non-reproductive individuals or reproductive males. Now, when the researchers examined the behavior of the observer fish, they found that gravid females, when they were observing, spent more time in cover, the weed that was supplied here in the center of the tank in the observation compartment. So they spent more time in cover while collecting this social information than did the reproductive males or non-reproductive individuals. And this is consistent with a tendency for increased risk-averse behavior when in a reproductive state. So gravid females are more conspicuous to predators, and they're less able to escape them, and so preferentially targeted by predators. Yet they have high metabolic costs because they're pregnant. So this means they should increase their reliance on social information in order to forage efficiently and safely. So the latter is achieved by collecting this information whilst undercover. Okay, another commonly observed state-based bias in animals is a strategy of copying others only if uncertain. Now, research I conducted with Lara Wood and Emma Flynn revealed that this tendency to rely on personal information and only use social information if uncertain does not actually appear to be the case in humans. So you can be in a state of uncertainty for several reasons. And the first example I'll show you is to do with copying others when uncertain because your personal information is inadequate in some way. And this has been found in diverse species, including insects, bats, birds, and primates. So in this example in ants, social information use is represented by increased following of pheromone trails left by other ants, as represented on the y-axis here. As you can see, it was found that when searching for food, ants used the pheromone trails to locate food much more when they had no prior experience of food resource location, so they were naive here, but also when they were uncertain about their prior visual experience of food location because of reduced light levels, so in darkness here. A similar result has also been found in ants when a new nest site has to be adopted by consensus of the colony when the current one has been destroyed. So here, if worker ants have prior information about a new nest site because they visited it and so are informed, represented by the light grey line here, then they are much more likely to commit to the new nest, indicated by transporting the brood to it, with minimal social information. So when there were kind of 0 to 3 or 4 ants at the new nest site when they last visited it, then they're much more likely to commit to that new nest if they don't have don't have any prior information. Likewise, in a study I conducted with chimpanzees, we found increased use of social information when individuals lacked personal information regarding how to access food from a task. Now you can see the task here, it's a simple puzzle box, and in order to acquire food, a grape, you just had to move the door either to the left or slide it to the right. And here the x-axis on this figure gives the number of previous manipulations chimpanzees had performed to extract food using method or option X, say for example, sliding to the left. So personal information on this axis increases from left to right. And the y-axis gives a proportion of individuals who switch away from using method X to using a different method. So you can see that the likelihood of switching is highest when personal information is minimal, here, and when the switch corresponds to the prevailing social information in the group. And now in this study, we also found another state-based bias, as subordinate individuals were much more likely to use social information than dominant individuals. So as with the blue tits, this perhaps indicates a copy if dissatisfied type strategy. Now, another way in which individuals can be uncertain and therefore favor social information is if it is very costly to collect personal information for yourself. For example, because it exposes you to predators or to toxic foods, or because it takes a long time to learn for yourself, so you lose opportunities to be doing something else. Now, small fish like these minnows are highly vulnerable to predation. So in this experiment by Mike Webster and Kevin Leyland, minnows were exposed to increasing levels of simulated predation risk, as indicated on the x-axis, with direct risk here indicating the highest risk level. And Webster and Leyland found that as predation risk increased, naive individuals were more likely to swim to a resource patch previously occupied by conspecifics. And this is representing the use of social information, which is indicated in white on these bars. So as you can see, the use of social information increases as predator risk increases. Likewise, in a study I conducted with callitrichid monkeys, who I exposed to extractive foraging tasks of differing difficulty, we see that reliance on social learning increases with task difficulty. So individuals use social information with this flip top task here, where individuals had to lift a door up and then reach in to get raisins. And this required much more trial and error to solve than the round box where they simply had to push their hand through a hole to push this door and get to some raisins, which they could solve quickly by themselves. So when individuals face little cost, say use of energy or lost opportunities to perform other useful behaviors, in collecting personal information for themselves, then this is preferable to running the risk of collecting potentially unreliable social information by observing others. Now, a third way for individuals to be uncertain and favor social information is because personal information is costly to actually use. So here we return to studies of sticklebacks again in the same setup as you saw earlier, except in this study, excuse me, the observer fish here has collected prior personal information about which of the two foraging patches is rich and which is and which is poor. Only then do they get to be an observer here and see demonstrators or models feeding at the two foraging patches. And importantly, this social information that they receive conflicts with their prior personal information. As the demonstrator fish feed at a higher rate in what was for the observer the poor patch than they do at what the observer fish had previously learnt was the rich patch. Now, in this study, Eifke van Bergen and colleagues made use of personal information costly by playing with how reliable it was and how outdated it was. And you can see the results on this figure, where the y-axis indicates the proportion of fish sticking to their personal information, and the x-axis, the reliability of the prior personal information that the observer fish has. So if the prior personal information was 100% reliable, such that the same patch was always the rich one when the fish were learning, then individuals used that personal information. But by the time the personal information is only 56% reliable, fish switch to using the conflicting social information rather than their personal information. Likewise, if private information has been collected very recently, then individuals use it, represented in the hashed bars here. But at the same time, as the time since they collected that information increases, as indicated moving along the x-axis here, they rely on that personal information less and less. So by day 7, since they collected that prior personal information, sticklebacks obviously deem foraging patch information to be outdated and are far more likely to follow the conflicting social information represented by the white bars and feed at the patch that they had previously learned was poor than stick to their personal information. And as you've seen, then individuals can flexibly adjust their decision making to exploit the best information available. And do not weight social and personal information equally, as used to be assumed by early empirical and theoretical work. So far, I've only showed you examples of studies of social learning strategies in captive animals. So I just want to show you a brief video highlighting an experimental study of social learning strategies in the wild by Erica van der Waal. And you'll hear more from her in the lecture on culture in primates.
Hello, I'm Erica. I study pink monkeys here in Africa. We wanted to know how much they learn from each other, so we did an experiment. We offered the monkeys of each group 2 boxes of food, one dyed in pink and one dyed in blue. One was made to taste bitter by soaking with aloe leaves. All the monkeys soon learned to eat only one color. When the young infants were on age to take their first solid food, we offered them again both color of food, but without any bitter taste. All the infants learned to prefer the color chosen by their mother. What was more surprising was what happened when male migrated from group eating blue into a group eating pink, or from a group eating pink into a group eating blue. All but one of the 10 males that we could track during the migration adopted the food color preferred in their new group. So these monkeys seems to follow our saying, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. There could be 2 quite different explanations. One is that some food is better in different places and that it's better to learn it from the locals. The other is that acting like the others help the males to be accepted in their new group. It's going to be difficult to know which one is the good explanation. Perhaps you could think about how we can find out.
So as you can see, it's really very difficult to identify social learning strategies in the wild, and even more difficult to distinguish different social learning strategies as potential explanations of observed behavior. Erica highlighted that it's difficult to know whether the migrant vervet monkey males were using a copy if uncertain type strategy or using what we might call a conformity strategy. In fact, researchers in this field went on to debate in the literature at quite some length what social learning strategies may have been at play in this study, and also another study of wild birds by Lucy Aplin, which you'll hear more about later in this lecture, and also from Lucy herself in her lecture on bird culture. So this is the end of this lecture segment, and in the next part we'll move on to considering frequency dependent biases, including the rather thorny issue of conformity.